I held him completely responsible for what happened to my daughter. I plotted and planned, but I never expected things to turn out this way. And I need to know if I was right or wrong. Whether it was my fault, an unfortunate accident, or if I'm even capable of telling the difference anymore. Let's just say my name is Jackson. You don't really need my first name, and to be honest, Jackson isn't my real name either. Unfortunately, it could be a bit dangerous for me if people figure out who I am. I'm telling you this story because it's weighed on my mind ever since that day, and maybe telling the tale will help me figure out how it all happened, and if I should stop blaming myself. The weight of that question has been crushing me for months now. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, sheets soaked with sweat, the memory of that day playing on an endless loop behind my eyelids. Other times I feel nothing at all, just a hollow emptiness where I imagine guilt should be. Before all this, I used to think people were either good or bad, that morality was a clear line you either crossed or didn't. Now I'm not so sure. It all started a few months ago on a cold, rainy afternoon. I was walking near the docks, trying to clear my head. The air was damp, and the rain slicked the wooden planks beneath my boots, making them slippery enough to demand my full attention. I was well prepared for the weather, though, a wide-brimmed hat and a scarf wrapped around my neck, shielding me from the biting wind that blew in from the sea. The docks had become something of a sanctuary for me since Ella died. There was something comforting about the rhythmic slap of waves against the pylons, the distant call of gulls, the smell of salt and seaweed and diesel. Nobody bothered me here. Nobody offered sympathetic smiles or awkward condolences. The sea didn't care about my grief, and there was freedom in that indifference. I'd been coming to this spot for weeks, walking the same path back and forth, watching the horizon where the gray sky met the even grayer water. In my coat pocket, my fingers would brush against the cold metal of the gun I'd purchased through channels I never would have considered before. The weight of it was both terrifying and reassuring. I hadn't decided yet what I was going to do with it, or maybe I had and just couldn't admit it to myself. That's when I saw Hedges. He was walking in the opposite direction, his head down against the rain. I wasn't expecting to see him, and certainly not there. There weren't many people about, which made it all the more surprising to run into him of all people. Hedges recognized me right away, despite my hat and scarf. I guess my face is memorable, thick brows and all that. I could tell he wasn't thrilled to see me. His expression changed the moment our eyes met. First surprise, then recognition, then something else. Was it fear? Guilt? Or just annoyance at encountering the grieving father he'd avoided in court? He was wearing an expensive-looking overcoat that probably cost more than I made in a month, and leather gloves that looked butter-soft. I was annoyed he could afford such luxury while my daughter's urn sat on my mantelpiece. I wasn't thrilled to see him either. The last time we'd crossed paths was at the inquest, and it hadn't gone well. You see, Hedges owned a taxi company, one that had a reputation for cutting corners. A few months back, my daughter Ella had taken one of his cabs. She was only 21. The driver, one of Hedges' guys, lost control of the car when the wheel locked up. They said the brakes had failed. The taxi slammed into a barrier, and poor Ella, she didn't make it. The driver had walked away with barely a scratch. Ella had been studying marine biology at the university. "The ocean is where all life began, Dad," she used to tell me, her eyes bright with passion. "Don't you think that's amazing? That we all came from the sea?" She'd been on her way to a late-night study session at the library when it happened. I'd offered to drive her, but she'd insisted on taking a cab so I wouldn't have to go out in the rain. "I'll be fine, Dad. It's just a 15-minute ride." Those were the last words she ever said to me. The police officer who came to my door at 2 a.m. didn't need to say anything. I knew the moment I saw his face. Time fractured in that instant. There was before and there was after, and nothing would ever bridge that gap. I couldn't accept it. I wanted answers, justice, something. But at the inquest, they ruled it an accident. I remember exactly how the judge put it. It was just an unfortunate accident, he'd said, trying to look sober and sympathetic, as if she wasn't just a statistic to him. The car was poorly maintained, sure, but there wasn't enough evidence to hold the company accountable. Hedges walked away scot-free, and my Ella was gone forever. I remembered sitting in that sterile courtroom, listening to the technical jargon about brake fluid levels and maintenance schedules. The company's lawyer, slick and confident in his tailored suit, had presented maintenance records that seemed suspiciously complete. The coroner had droned on about instantaneous death and minimal suffering, as if that was supposed to comfort me. And then there was Hedges himself, trying to look solemn while I testified, but smirking when he thought no one was looking. "Your Honor," I'd said, my voice cracking, "there were 7 complaints about that specific taxi in the 3 months before my daughter's death. 7 customers who reported brake issues. I have the records right here." I'd waved the papers I'd obtained through a contact at the Taxi Licensing Authority. "How many warnings did Mr. Hedges need?" The judge had looked at me with what seemed like genuine sympathy. "Mr. Jackson, while the court acknowledges your pain, these records alone don't establish criminal negligence. The defense has presented evidence of regular maintenance checks and—" "Falsified records!" I'd shouted, rising from my seat. "Everyone knows he cuts corners. Everyone knows—" His gavel had come down hard. "Mr. Jackson, control yourself or you'll be removed from this courtroom." I'd sat back down, trembling with rage and grief, as Hedges' lawyer smoothly continued his arguments about industry-standard practices and unfortunate mechanical failures that can occur despite the best precautions. When the verdict came, no criminal charges to be filed, Hedges had the audacity to approach me outside the courtroom. "I truly am sorry for your loss," he'd said, extending his hand, cameras flashing around us. I'd stared at that hand until he awkwardly withdrew it. The news the next day praised his attempt at reconciliation with the distraught father. Since then, I'd been carrying a weight I couldn't shake. Rage, grief, guilt. It all swirled together into something dark. I spent nights staring at the ceiling, replaying the hearing in my mind, trying to make sense of it. And then, one night, I decided, if no one else would hold Hedges accountable, I would. After the inquest, each day I would wake up, stare at Ella's photograph on the nightstand, go to work at the hardware store I'd managed for 15 years, come home, and drink until I could sleep. My few friends and my ex-wife Caroline called regularly, but I let most of those go to voicemail. "Jackson," she'd said in her last message, her voice tight with concern, "I'm worried about you. This isn't what Ella would want. She'd want you to live, to find some peace. Please call me back." I hadn't. I couldn't tell her that I spent my evenings researching untraceable firearms on the dark web, following Hedges, learning his routines and noting when he was alone, or that I sometimes stood outside his big house imagining what it would be like to ring the doorbell and see his face when he realized who I was. The gun had arrived 2 weeks ago, handed over in the back room of a bar I'd never visit again. It was smaller than I'd expected, but heavy. I'd never owned or wanted a firearm before, but when I held it, I was certain it was the right answer. That's how I ended up at the docks that day, with an untraceable gun in my coat. I was just walking, though, ironing out ideas in my head. It wasn't yet time, not yet D-Day. I hadn't fully committed to a plan. Part of me, the part that still remembered being Ella's father, the man who taught her to ride a bike, helped with science projects and promised to always protect her, hated the way I was thinking and the vicious, cold, unforgiving person I was becoming. But there was a darker side to me that had been growing stronger since the inquest, demanding for justice. The rain had picked up. A foghorn sounded in the distance, mournful and low. I'd been walking for nearly an hour, turning possibilities over in my mind. Should I confront him at his home? Follow him to his office? Wait for him in the parking garage he used? Each plan came with its own risks, its own complications. And now suddenly, he was right in front of me as if my thoughts had magically pulled him out from his safe hiding place. Hedges and I stopped when we were just a few feet apart. For a moment we stood there in silence, the rain falling between us. He looked at me, his lips curling into the faintest smirk. "Fancy seeing you here," he said, his voice sounding as if he was mocking me, a bit like two boxers before a fight. His voice was just as I remembered it from the courtroom, smooth and cultured. He looked out of place here among the weathered planks and rusted bollards, like a man who'd taken a wrong turn on his way to a cocktail party. I didn't respond. My jaw tightened, my hands balled into fists inside my coat pockets, one hand closed around the gun. My heart hammered loudly, but a strange calm settled over me, as if I were watching the scene from somewhere outside my body. "You know," he continued, "I've been meaning to say something about Ella. It's a damn shame what happened. The sound of her name on his lips sent a jolt of rage through me. How dare he speak about Ella, this man whose negligence had stolen her future? I could see Ella's face so clearly. Her curly hair that she'd inherited from her mother, her smile, the freckles across her nose that she'd always hated, but I'd found charming. "Don't," I managed to say. "Don't ever say her name." Hedges raised an eyebrow, raindrops beating on his expensive wool coat. "I'm trying to express condolences here. There's no need for hostility." Condolences. The word tasted bitter. It's been months. Where were these condolences when you were paying your lawyer to discredit my testimony? When you were falsifying maintenance records? He sighed, as if I were being unreasonable. "Look, Jackson. It is Jackson, right? The court made its decision. The evidence wasn't there. I run a business with over 50 vehicles. Sometimes things go wrong despite our best efforts." "Things go wrong?" I echoed, incredulous. "My daughter is dead. She was 21 years old. She was going to save the oceans, did you know that? She had plans and dreams and a whole life ahead of her. And she's gone because you couldn't be bothered to spend a few $100s on maintaining your car's brakes." A flash of annoyance crossed his face. "Now that's not fair. We follow safety protocols. It was a tragic accident, yes, but accidents happen every day. People die in cars every day." "Not in cars that are properly maintained," I replied, my voice rising. "Not in cars where the drivers report brake issues and are told to just finish the shift. That's what your driver told the police, you know, before your lawyer got to him and he suddenly couldn't remember saying it." Hedges glanced around, perhaps noting how isolated we were. His confidence seemed to waver for just a moment before his smug look reappeared. I couldn't believe it. There was just the two of us, no witnesses now, but he was still lying, justifying the evil things he'd done. "But you know," he said, his tone shifting to something almost conversational, "maybe if she'd just worn her seatbelt. Well, who knows, right? Could have been a different story." The world stopped. Everything, the rain, the wind, the distant sounds of the harbor, faded away until there was nothing but his face and those words hanging in the air between us. Had he just blamed Ella for her own death? My voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "What did you just say?" He shrugged, a casual gesture that made my blood boil. "The police report said she wasn't wearing a seatbelt. Maybe it wouldn't have saved her in such a big accident. But still, young people, you know, they think they're invincible." The memory flashed through my mind. The police officer explaining that Ella had removed her seatbelt just moments before the crash, perhaps to get something from her bag on the floor. The officer had been kind, saying that it wouldn't have made a difference given the speed and angle of impact. But here was Hedges, twisting that detail, using it to shift blame onto my dead daughter. That was it. The switch flipped. I didn't think, I just acted. My hand shot to the gun in my coat, and before I even realized what I was doing, I took it out and raised it in his direction. Now that the gun was actually in my hand, I was surprised by how heavy it was and how nervous I felt. Rain pattered against the barrel. My hand shook. It was very different from what I had imagined. I had thought I would be calm and even enjoy the moment, but instead I was shaken by the enormity of the step I wanted to take. It was such a final thing to do. Once done, it couldn't be reversed. This was real, not a rehearsal. I'd been waiting for a sign, but now, when it was time, I wasn't ready. Suddenly I realized I couldn't possibly shoot Hedges, no matter what he'd done, what he was responsible for. It wasn't right. It wasn't how I'd taught Ella, and she would never have wanted this. I was scared and angry with myself, and angry with him too for provoking me. I took refuge by trying to intimidate him. He didn't realize I would never shoot, so at least I could scare him, make him feel the way I'd felt all these months, and give him something to remember the next time he was tempted to skimp on repairing his taxis. "You don't get to blame her," I said, my voice eerily steady. "You don't get to walk away from this. Not again." Hedges' smirk disappeared. His eyes widened, and he took a step back, raising his hands. Whoa, take it easy," he said. "Easy?" I nearly laughed. "My daughter is dead, and you tell me to take it easy? Where was easy when I had to identify her body? When I had to pick out a casket for a 21-year-old? When I had to pack up her apartment and decide what to do with all her plans and dreams?" "Look," he said, his voice taking on a placating tone that only infuriated me further. "I understand you're grieving, I really do, but this—" he gestured toward the gun. "This isn't the answer. Think about what you're doing." "I've thought about nothing else for months," I replied. "Every night, every day. When I close my eyes, I see her face. When I open them, I see a world where you get to live while she doesn't. Tell me how that's fair." "Life isn't fair," he said. "But this won't bring her back. Nothing will." "No," I agreed, the gun unwavering. "Nothing will bring her back. But maybe this will stop you from putting another family through what mine has suffered. How many other corners are you cutting, Hedges? How many other time bombs are driving around this city with your company's name on the side?" The rain pounded harder, the sound filling the space between us. My heart was racing, and my finger hovered over the trigger. I could see him watching me, trying to calculate his next move. "You're not a killer, Jackson," he said, his voice gentle now, as if speaking to a frightened animal. "I can see that. You're a father who lost his daughter. I'm truly sorry for that loss." "Don't pretend to be sorry now," I spat. "Not when you had your chance in court. Not when you looked me in the eye and knew you were getting away with it. Is that what you think? That I'm some kind of monster who doesn't care? I have children too, you know. A son at university and a daughter in high school. I think about your Ella more than you might believe." The mention of his children confused me. I hadn't realized he was a father or imagined him having a family, loving someone the way I'd loved Ella. It complicated the picture I'd built in my head, the one where he was simply evil and I was justified. "If you have children," I said, the gun wavering slightly for the first time, "then how could you let this happen? How could you sleep at night knowing your decisions could affect someone else's child?" He took a small step forward, his hands still raised. "Business is complicated. Accidents happen despite our best efforts. I'm not saying we couldn't have done better. Maybe we could have. But I swear to you, if I'd known that Taxi had problems that could lead to what happened, I would have pulled it off the road immediately." Was he telling the truth? I couldn't tell anymore. I'd been so certain he was a monster, but now I wasn't so sure. Was he just a man who'd made wrong choices as we all do? And then he slipped. It happened so fast. One second he was standing there, and the next he was flailing, his foot sliding on the wet pier. He went over the edge and into the water with a splash. There was a moment, just a fraction of a second, where our eyes met as he began to fall. I saw surprise there, and fear, and something else I couldn't name. His arms windmilled, trying to find purchase on the slick wood, but gravity had already claimed him. The splash was surprisingly loud, cutting through the patter of rain. For a heartbeat, I stood frozen, the gun still extended toward the space where he had been. Water droplets from the splash landed on my face, mingling with the rain. A strange thought flitted through my mind. The sea that had taken my Ella's dreams was now reaching for Hedges. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. Then I moved to the edge and looked down. Hedges was thrashing in the murky water, his face pale with panic. "Help!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the rain. The water was choppy, dark with silt and debris stirred up by the recent storms. Hedges' expensive coat was clearly weighing him down, and his polished leather shoes would be filling with water, dragging him under. His face, when it surfaced, was a mask of pure terror. "Please," he gasped, before a wave slapped over him, pushing him back under. When he resurfaced, he was coughing, struggling to keep his head above water. I can't swim!" The irony struck me then. Hedges couldn't swim, yet my Ella had been a champion swimmer since she was 12, had qualified for nationals in high school, had chosen marine biology because of her love for the water. If their positions had been reversed, she would have been able to save herself. I looked around. There were a few people in the distance, but no one close enough to see what had happened. I spotted a long pole nearby, one of those ones they use for docking boats. I rushed over and grabbed it, extending it toward him. The pole was heavier than it looked, weathered wood that felt rough against my palms. I had to plant my feet firmly on the wet dock to manage its weight as I extended it toward Hedges' thrashing form. A voice in the back of my mind whispered that I could just walk away. No one had seen him fall. No one had seen the gun, which I'd hastily shoved back into my pocket. I could disappear, and nature would take its course. But another voice, one that sounded disturbingly like Ella's, whispered back, "That's not who you are, Dad." "Grab on!" I yelled. Hedges tried, but he was panicking, his arms flailing uselessly. He went under again, and when he came back up, he was gasping, his eyes wild with fear. "Hedges!" I shouted, trying to make my voice carry over the rain and wind. "Stop thrashing! Reach for the pole! Come on, you can do it!" It was surreal to find myself encouraging the man I'd been pointing a gun at moments before. Life had a twisted sense of humor sometimes. Or maybe this was some cosmic test of my character, a fork in the road where I could choose vengeance or mercy. I remembered teaching Ella to swim, her small hands clutching the edge of the pool, her eyes wide with apprehension. "I've got you," I'd promised. "I won't let go until you're ready." She'd believed me completely, as only a child can. Her trust had been the cornerstone of our relationship, even as she grew older. "You're the most honest person I know, Dad," she'd told me once during her rebellious teenage years. "Even when I'm mad at you, I always know you'll tell me the truth." What would she think of me now, standing on this dock with a gun in my pocket and a man's life in my hands? Finally, he managed to grab the pole. For a moment, relief washed over me. But then, I saw his face, his smug, self-satisfied face. And I remembered his words, his smirk, the way he'd walked away from the inquest without a care in the world while my daughter was 6 feet under. There was something in his expression as he clutched the pole, a flash of his courtroom confidence returning, as if now that he had a lifeline, he was already calculating his next move. Would he go to the police? Report that I'd threatened him with a gun? It would be his word against mine, but he was a respected businessman, and I was just a hardware store manager with a grudge. Who would they believe? "Pull me in!" he gasped, his knuckles white on the wooden pole. "For God's sake, pull me in!" I tried. I really did. I braced my feet and pulled, feeling the weight of him as he tried to use the pole to propel himself toward the dock, but the wood was slippery, and he was heavy with his waterlogged clothes. "I'm trying," I called back, "but you need to help. Kick your legs. Try to swim toward me." "I told you, I can't swim!" There was raw panic in his voice now, a primal fear that cut through his usual polished veneer. "Please, Jackson, please!" It was the first time he'd used my name without it sounding like an insult. For a moment, our eyes met across the churning water, and I saw something I hadn't expected: humanity. This wasn't the corporate villain I'd built up in my mind over months of grief and rage. This was just a man, flawed and frightened, clinging desperately to life, and then I thought about the gun. No one had seen it. No one would believe Hedges if he told them. But what if he did? What if he went to the police and told them I'd threatened him? What would happen to me then? I'd definitely lose my job, maybe face jail time. I'd have to sell the house where Ella had grown up, where her height marks were still penciled on the kitchen doorframe, where her laughter still seemed to echo in the quiet evenings. I'd lose everything that connected me to her. The thoughts swirled in my head, faster and faster, until I couldn't think straight. My fatigued muscles ached from the weight of the pole and the weight of Hedges and his soaked clothing. My chest muscles, my shoulders, and my abs were a mass of pain. I could barely breathe. I strained every muscle, but I couldn't bear the weight anymore. And before I could stop it, somehow, my hands loosened and let go of the pole. The moment hung suspended in time, my hands pulling away, the pole slipping from my grasp. There was a choice being made, but it didn't feel like I was the one making it. It felt like watching someone else, someone I didn't recognize. Hedges' eyes met mine, and for a split second, I saw something in them. Shock, betrayal, desperation. And then he was gone. The water closed over his head, and the rain kept falling, and I just stood there, staring at the spot where he'd been. The surface of the water churned for a few more seconds, bubbles rising where he'd gone under, and then nothing. Just the endless gray of the harbor, indifferent to the life it had just claimed. I felt strangely hollow, as if something vital had been scooped out of my chest. Numb, shocked, horrified, as if I just witnessed someone else commit a terrible crime. "Hey!" The shout came from behind me, startling me out of my trance. I turned to see a dock worker running toward me, rain slicking his yellow jacket. "What happened? Did somebody fall in?" I nodded, unable to find my voice at first. Then, "A man!" He slipped. I tried to help him with that pole, but I gestured helplessly toward the water. The dock worker didn't hesitate. He shucked off his jacket and boots and dove in with a practiced motion that spoke of years working near water. I watched, numb, as he surfaced and began to search, diving and resurfacing, diving again. More people were arriving now, drawn by the commotion. Someone was calling for emergency services on a cell phone. A woman put her hand on my shoulder, asked if I was all right, said I looked pale. I must have answered, but I don't remember what I said. All I could think was, I let him die. I had the power to save him and I chose not to. What did that make me? By the time other people arrived, it was too late. They looked at me with pity, told me it wasn't my fault. They'd seen me trying to save him. One man even clapped me on the shoulder and said I'd done my best. "These docks get so slippery in the rain," an older man said, shaking his head sadly as the paramedics finally pulled Hedges' body from the water. The city's been promising to install better grip surfaces for years, but budget cuts, you know how it is. They'd thrown blankets around my shoulders at some point, trying to ward off shock. I must have been shivering, though I didn't feel cold. I didn't feel much of anything. A police officer was taking statements, his notebook already spotted with raindrops. "Can you tell me exactly what happened, sir?" he asked, pen poised. The gun felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket. Any moment now, I expected someone to notice it, to point and shout, "He has a weapon!" But no one did. It remained my secret. "We were just talking," I heard myself say, my voice strangely detached. "I didn't know him. We were passing each other on the dock when he slipped. It happened so fast. I grabbed that pole to try to help, but he couldn't reach it in time." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. I certainly knew him, and I'd left out the gun, the confrontation, the moment of decision when I'd let go of the pole. Was that the same as lying? If I told the whole truth, there was no way they'd believe it was just an accident, or that he'd just happened to slip when the father of his victim was nearby. The officer nodded sympathetically. "That's just what other witnesses saw. Don't blame yourself, sir. These accidents happen. You did what you could." I slipped away, leaving a false name and address. Fortunately, I still had my hat on and my thick scarf covering most of my face. Besides which, there was no CCTV on the docks, and it was dark and rainy. I walked for hours in the rain. The gun was still in my pocket, heavier than ever. When I reached the old stone bridge that crossed the river on the edge of town, I stood there for a while, looking down at the rushing water below, then took the gun out and dropped it in. It didn't even make a splash before it was gone forever, carried away by the current. One burden was gone, but the heaviest one remained. A week later, I was at Ella's grave. The small granite headstone read, "Ella Marie Jackson," it read, "Beloved daughter, 2003 to 2024. The sea always calls us home." She'd loved that quote. I knelt in the mud beside her grave, rain plastering my hair to my forehead. I whispered, "I don't know what to do, Ella. I don't know who I am anymore. It happened so fast. I had it all planned out, but then he fell. I had a chance to harm him, and I didn't. Then I had a chance to save him, but I couldn't. What does that make me? I couldn't pull the trigger, but I didn't save his life either." The grave, of course, offered no answers, no solutions. Now, here I am, months later, sitting in my local diner, a steaming cup of coffee in front of me. The sun was shining outside, a stark contrast to the storm that still raged inside me. The shop owner handed me the daily newspaper, and I flipped through it absently, until a headline caught my eye. "Inquest concludes. Local entrepreneur's death ruled an accident." The article described how several witnesses saw a man heroically attempting to save Mr. Hedges with a dock pole before he disappeared beneath the waves. There was no mention of our argument, the gun, or the moment I let go. As far as the world was concerned, I was blameless. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same system that failed to hold Hedges accountable for Ella's death had now absolved me of any responsibility for his. I guess you could call it cosmic balancing. Or was it justice? Or was it plain coincidence? I didn't try to kill him, and in the end, I didn't want him to die. But if we hadn't met that day, he would still be alive. I quickly scanned the rest of the article, my coffee growing cold beside me. There was a quote from Hedges' wife, expressing gratitude to the unknown Good Samaritan who'd tried to save her husband. The article ended with a note from his family, offering a reward to the unknown man who had tried so valiantly to save Hedges. I felt rather sick at the thought, and sad for his family, pushing away my coffee untouched. I folded the paper and set it aside, reflecting. The waitress gave me a concerned look and asked if everything was all right. I managed a nod, and as I left, I handed her a tip that was probably much too large. Outside, the spring sunshine felt inappropriate, offensive almost. People were going about their days, shopping, laughing, living, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, at least for me. I wasn't the same person I was before that day on the dock. For the first time in months, I felt light, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. No one will ever know what actually happened except me and you, and maybe that's for the best. After all, there it was, stated clearly and officially for the record, in black and white. It had just been an unfortunate accident. Thanks for listening, everyone. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Drop a comment below if you've ever had, or know of a situation that turned out differently than expected, or want to share your thoughts about this tale. I'd love to hear your stories, and remember to hit that notification bell to stay updated about more unusual tales.